Imagine you're alone at home, the world outside quiet and still. You're scrolling through your phone, maybe catching up on some late-night messages. Then, suddenly, the sound of your phone vibrating breaks the silence. A number you don't recognize flashes across the screen. You hesitate for a moment, unsure whether to answer. Maybe it's a spam call. Or perhaps a wrong number. But then, something within you, a strange, inexplicable pull, urges you to pick up. You press the green button. The phone connects, and you bring it to your ear. At first, there's nothing. Just static. The kind of crackling noise you hear when the connection is bad. You think about hanging up, but before you can, a voice breaks through the static. It's soft, almost soothing at first. You can't make out the words, but the voice sounds familiar. Hello. You say, unsure if it's someone playing a prank or a mistake in the call. Then, it happens. The voice, still faint, says your name. Not just your first name, but a nickname only a few people know. A nickname only your closest friends or family would use. Your heart races as confusion and fear grip you. You wait for more. The voice continues, each word sending a chill down your spine. It's a voice from the past, a voice you recognize, but it shouldn't be on the other side of the line. It's someone you've lost contact with. Someone you thought you'd never hear from again. But there's something off about the tone. There's something haunting about it. It's not a normal phone call, it's something far more sinister. This is not a story about a phone glitch or a prank call. This is about real, chilling experiences. The kind of experience that has haunted the small town of Subrink for decades. A mystery that remains unsolved, but one that continues to draw people into its web of terror. This is a case about the eerie, unexplainable phone calls that have terrorized the residents of Subrink, a quiet, almost forgotten town tucked away in the hills. What began as rumors quickly escalated into something far more dangerous, a phenomenon that has left both law enforcement and experts stumped. These calls are not just ordinary. They carry with them a darkness that has swallowed lives, left people terrified, and most disturbingly, changed the course of their fates forever. In the following chapters, we'll dive into the heart of the mystery, piece together the chilling stories of those who received these calls, and uncover the secrets buried deep within Subrink. Who is behind these calls? Are they just random, or is there something more to them? Something far more terrifying than anyone could have ever imagined? But first, let me ask you, how would you react if you picked up a phone call in the middle of the night, only to hear a voice from your past, someone you've lost touch with for years, speaking to you in the most chilling way possible? Would you hang up immediately? Would you try to trace the number, or would you let the conversation continue, hoping for an explanation that could somehow justify the growing sense of dread? As we unfold this eerie tale, you'll discover that the people of Subrink weren't just dealing with a prank or a glitch. They were faced with something much darker. And the more they tried to understand it, the deeper they got caught in its grip. So, prepare yourself for a journey into a mystery unlike any other. This is not the kind of story you can easily forget, and once you hear it, you'll find yourself questioning the next time your phone rings, especially if you don't recognize the number. The call that should never have been answered may just be the call you never wanted to make in the first place. Subrink is not a place many people know about. Tucked away in the rolling hills of the Appalachian region, it's the kind of town that, if you blinked, you'd miss it. A quaint little settlement with cobblestone streets, a handful of aging houses, and a quiet, almost eerie stillness in the air. It's the sort of place that would never make the headlines, unless, of course, something unimaginable were to happen. Something that shook the very foundation of the town, and forever changed the lives of those who called it home. For decades, Subrink had been a quiet, unassuming place. The town had only a few hundred residents, mostly older folks who had lived there their entire lives, young families trying to make a living, and the occasional traveler passing through on their way to somewhere else. The town was picturesque in an almost haunting way. It had charm, sure, but there was something about the place that always seemed off. Maybe it was the thick woods that surrounded it, casting long, shadowy figures as the sun began to set. Or perhaps it was the way the fog would creep in during the early morning hours, blanketing everything in a soft, white silence. Whatever it was, Subrink had an undeniable aura of mystery about it. It wasn't always this way, of course. In the early days, Subrink had been a thriving hub, a town that flourished thanks to the surrounding coal mines and lumber industry. People from all over the region would come to work, and the town was once filled with bustling energy. But as the years passed and the industries closed, the population dwindled. Those who had lived in Subrink for generations began passing on, and the town's vitality seemed to vanish along with them. The young folks grew up, and instead of staying to build a life in the place they called home, they sought opportunities elsewhere, leaving Subrink behind. By the time the strange events began, Subrink had already become a ghost of its former self. The streets were mostly empty during the day, and the only sound you could hear was the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. The houses, though still standing, seemed like relics of a bygone era, their wooden frames creaking in the wind. Some of them had been abandoned for years, and there were rumors that the land itself had started to reclaim the homes. Vines creeping up the sides, trees growing too close to windows. It was a town that looked like it had been forgotten by time. However, in 1987, something happened that changed everything. Something that would haunt the town and its people for decades to come. The first signs were subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. People began reporting strange occurrences in the night. At first it was just odd sounds. Low, muffled noises coming from the woods just beyond the town. It was the kind of thing that people might dismiss as the wind or a wild animal. But as the months went on, those sounds began to grow louder, more distinct and more unnerving. People would hear footsteps in the woods, even when no one was supposed to be there. Occasionally, there would be flickers of light near the edges of town. Strange, glowing shapes that seemed to float in the air and disappear before anyone could get a closer look. Some of the older residents, the ones who had been around long enough to remember Subrink's heyday, would tell stories about the old days when things used to be different. Nothing like this ever happened back when we had the mills, they would say. But even they couldn't explain the strange occurrences that started to unravel the quiet fabric of life in Subrink. And then, one night in early December, a woman named Clara Williams received the first phone call. Clara was an elderly widow, a woman who had lived in Subrink for over 50 years. She was well known in the community, her small cottage tucked away at the edge of the town, near the woods. People would often drop by her house to chat, and she was always eager to share her memories of the town's better days. But on that particular night, Clara was alone, sitting in her cozy living room with a cup of tea, watching the news on her old television set. It was around 10:30 p.m. when the phone rang. Clara, who hadn't been expecting any calls, slowly made her way over to the kitchen, where the rotary phone sat on the wall. She picked up the receiver and brought it to her ear, but all she heard was static. At first, she thought it was just a bad connection. But then, through the static, she heard something else. A voice. It was faint at first, but as Clara strained to listen, the voice became clearer. It was calling her name. Clara. Her heart skipped a beat. The voice sounded so familiar. It was the voice of her late husband, James, who had passed away 2 years earlier. At first, Clara was stunned, frozen in place. She couldn't understand how this was possible. Her mind raced. Maybe someone was playing a cruel joke, or perhaps it was a glitch in the phone system. But as the voice continued to speak, her disbelief began to turn into fear. The voice whispered things to her, things only James would know. Personal details about their life together, intimate memories they had shared. But what struck Clara most was the tone of the voice. It was filled with a deep sadness, a kind of sorrow that she had never heard in James's voice before. Clara, they're coming for you. The voice warned. Clara's hands began to tremble, and she dropped the receiver, watching as the phone line disconnected. But she was too scared to even think about calling the operator. The eerie silence that followed felt heavier than ever before. The room was suffocating, and the only sound was the frantic beating of her heart. The next morning, Clara told her neighbors about the call. They all listened with concern, but dismissed it as a bad dream, or perhaps just a glitch in the phone lines. After all, Subrink had old infrastructure. Who knew what kind of weird things might happen when the lines were so out of date? But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She knew the voice she had heard wasn't just a malfunction. It had been James. Somehow, someway, he had reached out to her. Over the next few days, Other residents of Subrink began experiencing similar phone calls. But they weren't from loved ones who had passed, they were from strangers. Strangers who knew intimate details about their lives. Details they couldn't explain how anyone could know. One man, Thomas Green, received a call from his late father, warning him to leave town before it was too late. Another woman, Mary Thompson, received a call from a voice that described her childhood home with such precision that she believed it was a relative trying to contact her. But the message, just like Clara's, was filled with ominous warnings. The calls grew more frequent. The voices became more insistent. They weren't just calling to warn. They were calling to prepare. And no one knew exactly for what. But it became clear that these phone calls were part of something much bigger. Something far more sinister. In the following weeks, Subrink would change forever. The once peaceful town was now under siege by an unknown force, a force that reached out from the other side, using the telephone lines as a bridge between worlds. And as the town's residents began to experience these terrifying calls, they would quickly realize that answering the phone could very well be a decision that would haunt them forever. This was just the beginning of the mystery that would consume Subrink. The calls had begun. But what they would lead to, no one could have ever imagined. The first whispers of the strange phone calls quickly spread through Subrink like wildfire. What began as a singular unsettling incident in Clara Williams's home soon escalated into a full-blown phenomenon. By the second week of December, the town was on edge. Every phone call seemed to carry a sense of foreboding, a dark energy that no one could explain. It wasn't just the older generation, those familiar with the town's history, that felt this dread. Even the younger families, who had moved to Subrink seeking a quiet, peaceful life, found themselves gripped by fear and confusion. Something was terribly wrong, and the phones were the conduit through which it was all coming to the surface. At first, the calls were dismissed as coincidences. After all, Subrink was a small town, and it wasn't unusual for people to know each other's business, especially in a place where everyone seemed to be related or had lived there for decades. But as the days passed, the nature of the calls became more alarming. They weren't just random, disconnected statements. They were personal, intimate, and unsettlingly accurate. The voices on the other end of the line knew things about the residents that no one outside their circle could possibly know. And these voices, though familiar, weren't quite right. They came through cracked and distorted, as if they were traveling through something dark, something inhuman. One evening, after a particularly chilling call, Thomas Green, a local mechanic and one of the younger residents of Subrink, gathered a small group of people at the local diner. They met quietly, exchanging stories about the voices on the other end of their phone lines. "I don't know what to think anymore," Thomas admitted, his voice a mix of fear and disbelief. "I know it sounds crazy, but I'm sure I heard my father's voice the other night. And I know he's been dead for years." Thomas's father had passed away suddenly from a heart attack 2 years prior. It had been a devastating blow for the Green family, and even now, Thomas would often find himself haunted by memories of his father's gruff but loving voice. But the phone call? It hadn't been a memory, it had been his father's voice, and yet it had come through like an echo from some far-off place, filled with a sense of urgency and sorrow. The message, however, was chilling. "Leave the town, it's not safe anymore." At first, Thomas thought it was some kind of prank. His father had always warned him to trust his instincts, and so when he heard that voice, it stirred something deep within him. But when he tried to call back, the number was no longer in service. The next day his mother received a call too, this time from his younger sister, who had died in a car accident 5 years ago. This pattern continued, with voices from the past reaching out to the living. Sometimes it was a mother warning her child, other times it was an old friend offering cryptic advice. Yet, for each person who received a call, the message was eerily similar. "Leave Subrink. It's not safe." As more residents came forward with their own experiences, the nature of the calls began to shift. They were no longer just echoes of the dead. Some were new voices, distorted and foreign, but unmistakably human. The people of Subrink were terrified, unsure of what to make of these phenomena. Could it be some sort of mass hysteria? Or was there something truly supernatural at play? There was one thing that everyone agreed on. The phone lines were being used as a bridge between worlds, and whatever was reaching through them was not meant to be there. One particularly disturbing report came from Mary Thompson, a woman in her late 30s who had lived in Subrink for most of her life. Mary had always been skeptical of anything supernatural, preferring to stick to logical explanations and dismissing any talk of ghosts or spirits as mere superstition. But when she received her first phone call, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew. "I was sitting at my kitchen table eating dinner when the phone rang," Mary recalled, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "At first, I thought it was just a wrong number, but when I picked up the receiver, there was a voice on the other end, clear as day." The voice was unfamiliar, yet somehow soothing, almost hypnotic in its cadence. "Mary, it's time to face the truth," it said. "You've been running from it for far too long." Mary's first thought was that someone was messing with her. She had a few close friends in town who liked to play pranks, and she assumed it was one of them trying to get a rise out of her. But then the voice began speaking to her in a way that cut through the layers of doubt. It spoke about events in her life that no one else could have known. The time she had been involved in a car accident as a teenager, her father's long battle with cancer, the fear she had of becoming her mother, who had passed away from the same illness. But then came the part that left Mary frozen in place. "You must stop running. You know what you've done. You know what's coming." The call ended abruptly, and Mary was left in a state of shock. The voice was gone, but the words lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. Who was this voice? How could it know these intimate details about her life? And more importantly, what did it mean by "what's coming"? The next few days saw an increase in calls to the local police station. At first, the authorities were dismissive, chalking the strange reports up to a series of isolated incidents, cases of overactive imaginations, perhaps, or the result of a few too many late-night movies. But when multiple officers began receiving their own strange phone calls, each eerily similar to the ones described by the townspeople, the sheriff's office was forced to take the situation more seriously. Sheriff Alan Westbrook, a man who had served in Subrink for over 20 years, was a practical, no-nonsense kind of person. He had dealt with all kinds of strange occurrences during his career: drunken brawls, domestic disputes, even a couple of minor break-ins. But what he was hearing from his deputies and local residents about these phone calls, that was something else entirely. "I've been in this town my whole life," Sheriff Westbrook said, his voice heavy with the weight of his years of experience. "And I've never heard anything like this. People aren't just making this up." It wasn't long before rumors began circulating about the true nature of the calls. Some believed they were messages from the dead, souls trapped in limbo, desperately trying to communicate with their loved ones before they moved on. Others whispered about the possibility of dark forces at play, forces that used the phones as a gateway to invade the lives of Subrink's residents. And still, others were more practical, suggesting that someone in town was pulling a prank, using the town's outdated phone lines to create fear and chaos. But the truth, as everyone would soon learn, was far more terrifying than any of these theories. By Christmas Eve, Subrink was in full-blown crisis mode. People were locking their doors, refusing to answer the phone, and making plans to leave. The local church held special prayer services, asking for divine intervention. But no one was prepared for the final, terrifying twist to the story. The calls weren't just coming from the dead anymore. They were coming from something else. Sophia Devereux had always been a quiet, reserved woman. In her mid-30s, she lived alone in a small, cozy house on the outskirts of Subrink. Though she was well-liked by her neighbors, Sophia had a tendency to keep to herself. Perhaps it was the grief from losing her parents at a young age, or the trauma of growing up in a town filled with secrets, but Sophia rarely ventured beyond the confines of her home. Instead, she found comfort in her routine, working as a local librarian by day, and reading books on obscure subjects by night. Her life was simple, uneventful. Until one cold evening in December, everything changed. It was a Thursday night when Sophia received the call. The weather outside had turned bitterly cold, with a harsh wind howling through the trees and flurries of snow beginning to fall. The small town of Subrink was as quiet as ever, the only sounds the occasional car passing by and the creak of branches in the wind. Sophia sat by her fireplace, curled up with a novel, when her phone rang. At first it was nothing unusual. She reached for the receiver, her fingers lightly brushing the cold plastic of the old rotary phone she had inherited from her grandmother. When she picked up the phone, however, the feeling in the pit of her stomach instantly changed. There was an odd crackling sound on the other end, followed by a deep static-laden voice that sent a chill through her entire body. "Sophia," the voice rasped, its tone hoarse and unnatural. Sophia froze. She didn't recognize the voice, but it somehow felt familiar. The way it spoke her name, like it had been rehearsed. She could feel her pulse quicken, but she remained silent, hoping the call would end, that it was some sort of prank. But the voice continued. "Don't ignore me. You know what I want." It wasn't just the words that terrified Sophia. It was the way they were delivered, cold, almost mechanical, like the voice was coming from somewhere far beyond this world. It was as if the phone line had turned into a portal, allowing something sinister to slip through. Sophia pulled the receiver away from her ear, her hand trembling. She wanted to hang up, to escape from the suffocating grip of the call, but something held her there. There was something almost hypnotic about the voice, something that made her feel like she had no choice but to listen. "Why are you doing this?" Sophia whispered into the receiver, her voice barely audible over the static. But there was no reply. Just a long, haunting silence. It was at that moment that Sophia realized something truly horrifying. The voice wasn't merely speaking to her, it was waiting for her to speak. It was a confrontation, a test. And Sophia was trapped in it. "Do you remember what happened to your parents, Sophia?" The voice asked, its tone dripping with malevolent intent. The question hit Sophia like a punch to the gut. Her parents had died when she was just a child, in a tragic car accident that had left her an orphan. The event had shaped her entire life, her personality, and her outlook on the world. She had tried to put it behind her, but there were times, especially on nights like this, when the pain resurfaced. "Stop," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. "Stop. Please." But the voice wasn't finished. It was relentless, a cold force that seemed to know everything about her, as if it had been watching her all these years. "You haven't forgotten, have you?" The voice continued. "You haven't forgotten how you ran away from them, how you abandoned them." The words hit Sophia like a sledgehammer. She knew what the voice was referring to, the night of the accident. She had been in the car with her parents when the crash occurred. But it wasn't just the accident that haunted Sophia. It was the moment right before it. When she had left them. She had gotten into a fight with her parents over something insignificant, and in a moment of stubbornness, she had stormed out of the car. They were the ones who drove off. And they were the ones who died. Her parents' deaths had never fully made sense to Sophia, and in her darker moments, she wondered if somehow, her leaving them that night had caused it all. But she had never allowed herself to believe it, burying the guilt deep within her. Until now. "You left them to die, Sophia," the voice repeated, as if savoring the words. "You abandoned them when they needed you most." Sophia gasped, her hand clutching the phone tightly, as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. It was just a nightmare, a cruel prank. She had to convince herself of that, or else she would lose her mind. "No," she muttered under her breath. "No, it wasn't like that. It wasn't my fault." But the voice didn't relent. "You can't hide from the truth. You'll never escape it. You'll never escape me." Sophia felt the air grow colder, the temperature in her house plummeting, as if a chill had descended from the phone line itself. The shadows in her living room seemed to grow longer, and the quiet night outside felt oppressive, as though the very town of Subrink was holding its breath. "Who are you?" Sophia cried, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and desperation. "Who are you, and what do you want from me?" The voice paused, and in the silence that followed, Sophia could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The air around her seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. Then, slowly, as if savoring the moment, the voice responded. "I am what you fear most. And you will never escape." With that final, chilling declaration, the line went dead. Sophia was left standing there, the phone still pressed to her ear, but the connection was lost. The silence that followed was suffocating, and it felt as though the entire world had shifted, leaving her standing in the aftermath of something unspeakable. She dropped the receiver, her hands shaking, her breath coming in shallow gasps. But the terror didn't end with the phone call. It lingered. The voice had left an imprint on Sophia's mind, like a shadow that would never leave her. She tried to tell herself it was just a figment of her imagination, a stress-induced hallucination. But deep down, Sophia knew the truth. Something had spoken to her, something dark, and it wasn't done with her yet. The days that followed were filled with dread. Sophia couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched, that the eyes of something sinister were upon her. She couldn't shake the image of the voice, the way it had cut through her, how it had known her darkest secret. The phone call wasn't just a call, it was a warning. And as the hours passed, Sophia began to realize that the warning wasn't just meant for her. It was meant for the entire town of Subrink. The following morning, Subrink was a town in turmoil. The eerie phone call that had shattered Sophia's night was just the beginning of something far darker, a ripple in the calm of a town that had always prided itself on its tranquility. Sophia, still in shock, had rushed to the local police station at the first light of day, desperate to make sense of the unexplainable events she had experienced. Detective James Parker was the first to hear her story. Parker, a seasoned investigator with over 15 years of experience, was known for his skepticism and rational approach to crime. He had seen his fair share of unusual cases, but something about Sophia's account of the phone call unsettled him. Her voice trembled with genuine fear, and the details of her story were so precise, so specific, that it was impossible to dismiss as a mere hallucination or prank. At first, Detective Parker approached the situation with caution. Subrink wasn't a town known for criminal activity, let alone supernatural occurrences. His initial thoughts leaned toward a possible hoax, maybe an elaborate prank, or someone with a deep knowledge of Sophia's past, trying to manipulate her emotions. But as the morning turned into afternoon, and more residents came forward with their own bizarre experiences, Parker couldn't ignore the growing pattern. By the time the sun had begun to set, a handful of people had visited the station, each telling a version of the same story. It was always the same: an unknown caller, a voice that spoke their name, and cryptic references to their past that no one but the caller could have known. Something was happening in Subrink, something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. A growing web of fear. Detective Parker knew that he needed to take action, but where to begin? He was not a man given to superstition, yet there was something undeniably chilling about the consistency of these calls. The voice, ominous, knowing, relentless, seemed to carry with it a sense of malice, something far beyond a simple prank or a hoax. He began compiling a list of victims, each one telling similar tales. In addition to Sophia, there was Charles Whitman, a local schoolteacher who had received a call in the middle of the night, followed by Olivia Harris, a waitress at the town's only diner. Each individual had reported the same disturbing experiences, calls that referenced past traumas, secrets buried deep within their pasts, things no one should have known. One by one, Parker interviewed each of them. Sophia's story was by far the most harrowing, but there was a common thread running through every account. The callers weren't just terrorizing the residents, they were tapping into their fears, their regrets, their darkest memories. The voice on the other end seemed to hold a deep understanding of their innermost selves, as though it had been studying them for years. But who, or what, could have had access to such knowledge? Parker's initial theory was that someone in town had been secretly observing the victims, perhaps collecting personal information and using it against them. But as the days went by, and the calls continued to plague Subrink, he began to entertain darker possibilities. Could the town's strange history be connected? Was there something hidden beneath the surface of Subrink that was only now beginning to reveal itself? A link to the past. Subrink had always been a quiet, almost forgotten town on the edge of the map. Nestled in the shadow of the dense woods and far from major highways, it had never been a place of note. Its history was modest, its population small. But as Parker dug into the town's records, he discovered something disturbing. Whispers of tragedies from long ago that had been buried and largely forgotten by the townspeople. In the town's early years, there were rumors of strange disappearances, unexplained deaths, and unsettling occurrences. The most infamous of these was the case of the Devereux family, Sophia's own ancestors. Decades ago, The family had lived in a grand estate on the outskirts of town, but in the early 1900s, tragedy struck. The family vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind only a scattered collection of oddities, letters, diaries, and peculiar artifacts. The town had largely moved on, but a small group of locals, those with long memories, still whispered about the Devereux family's curse, the strange things that had happened in the wake of their disappearance. Could there be a connection between the events of the past and the recent surge in disturbing phone calls? Parker didn't know, but the more he investigated, the more it seemed that Subrink's history was tied to something darker than anyone realized. The investigation into the strange phone calls in Subrink had reached a critical point. Detective Parker had assembled a group of local experts, each bringing their own knowledge to the table, in the hope of uncovering the truth behind the terrifying events. As theories swirled and the tension continued to rise, the once peaceful town became a battleground for different schools of thought. Was there a logical, scientific explanation behind the calls, or were they a manifestation of something more sinister, a force beyond understanding? And if it wasn't paranormal, could there be another, more frightening explanation? Something darker, something man-made? This chapter focuses on the various theories that surfaced as the investigation deepened. From scientific speculation to ghostly phenomena, and even whispers of top-secret government experiments, the theories varied wildly. As each expert offered their perspective, Detective Parker found himself navigating a labyrinth of possibilities, none of which provided the answers he desperately sought. Theories of the rational mind. Could it be a scientific phenomenon? Detective Parker, ever the skeptic, initially entertained the possibility that there was a logical explanation for the strange occurrences. Subrink was a small town, and the majority of its residents were not inclined to believe in supernatural phenomena. Parker's instinct was to search for a scientific or technological explanation, something tangible, something grounded in reason. The first theory came from Dr. Emma Lowell, a respected local physicist who had been following the case with growing concern. Emma, a pragmatic scientist who had spent most of her career studying electromagnetic fields and sound frequencies, suggested that the strange phone calls could be the result of an advanced technology, one that was somehow manipulating sound waves in a way that distorted reality. Imagine a sound frequency so powerful it can reach into a person's mind, creating the illusion of a voice that isn't really there, Dr. Lowell explained during a meeting with Parker. It's a form of auditory hallucination induced by sound waves that interact with the brain in an unusual way. We know that certain frequencies can influence emotional responses, even induce fear or anxiety. But what if someone figured out how to tap into that? Emma's hypothesis was grounded in the concept of infrasound, a type of sound frequency that is below the range of human hearing but still detectable by the body. Infrasound is known to cause feelings of unease, dizziness, and even panic. Some theorists believe that infrasound can create hallucinations, particularly when it interacts with the human brain in an unnatural way. If someone had access to this kind of technology, Emma continued, it would be relatively simple to broadcast these frequencies through ordinary phone lines. The calls people are hearing may be nothing more than the result of an experiment gone wrong, or a highly sophisticated form of psychological manipulation. It was an intriguing theory, but it left too many questions unanswered. Who would be conducting such an experiment and why? Was it possible that someone had designed a technology powerful enough to manipulate people's perceptions so subtly, yet so profoundly? Emma's theory was a step in the right direction, but it didn't explain the deeper, more ominous aspects of the case, the references to personal memories, the foreknowledge of intimate details of people's lives, or the eerie, almost sentient quality of the voices on the other end of the line. The paranormal explanation, voices from the beyond. As the investigation continued, a darker, more chilling possibility began to surface, one that suggested the phone calls might not be a product of science at all, but instead, something far more supernatural. One of the first to bring up the paranormal angle was Father Michael O'Connor, the town's priest, who had been deeply unsettled by the events unfolding in Subrink. Father O'Connor had heard the rumors of the Devereux family curse, the strange disappearances, the fire, the voices, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the events happening now were connected to something far older, something that lay dormant beneath the town's surface. "I've seen things in my years of ministry," Father O'Connor said gravely, speaking to Parker in the dimly lit church office. Things that can't be explained by science or reason. The world isn't just what we can see with our eyes. There are forces at work, spiritual forces, that we don't fully understand. What we're dealing with here might not be of this world. Father O'Connor believed the voices on the phone were the result of a haunting, or even a form of possession. He explained that throughout history, there had been cases where the dead, or malevolent spirits, used communication devices, like telephones or radios, to reach the living. In some of these cases, the spirits were seeking closure, while in others, they were tormenting the living, seeking to claim souls or exact vengeance for unresolved wrongs. The Devereux family in particular seems to have a connection to all of this, Father O'Connor continued. Their deaths were never fully explained, and there are rumors of strange rituals taking place at the estate before they disappeared. It could be that their spirits are trapped, trying to make contact with the living. Or worse yet, they could be malevolent spirits, wreaking havoc on the town as a form of revenge. Father O'Connor's theory was compelling, but it lacked the evidence needed to support it. There were no physical signs of paranormal activity, no cold spots, no unexplained sounds, no objects moving of their own accord. The only evidence that remained was the voices on the phone. Was it possible that the spirits of the Devereux family, or some other entity, were using technology as a vessel to communicate with the living? The darker possibility, a secret government experiment. While some of the theories leaned toward the supernatural, others took a far darker turn, toward the possibility that the phone calls were the result of a top-secret government experiment. Subrink, with its remote location and unassuming population, seemed the perfect place for such an operation to be conducted, without attracting too much attention. One theory, put forth by Gabriel Finch, the local historian, was that the strange occurrences in Subrink were connected to the government's history of mind control experiments. Finch was particularly fascinated by the period following World War II, when the U.S. government funded several covert projects aimed at researching psychological manipulation, behavior modification, and even telepathic communication. There was the infamous MKUltra project, Gabriel explained during one of his late-night discussions with Parker. An experiment that sought to control and influence people's thoughts through drugs, hypnosis, and even electromagnetic pulses. But what if they took things a step further? What if they were testing a new form of psychological warfare in a small town like Subrink? Imagine a technology capable of remotely manipulating a person's thoughts, memories, and fears. The theory was chilling, and it offered a frightening explanation for the strange calls. If the government had indeed been experimenting with new technologies in Subrink, it was possible that they had inadvertently, or deliberately, unleashed a force far beyond their control. The mysterious phone calls could be the unintended result of these experiments, an effort to induce fear, manipulate the mind, or even trigger traumatic memories in order to study human responses. This isn't just about a haunted house or a family curse, Gabriel argued. What if this is something much darker? A weapon, a tool for control. Subrink might just be the testing ground for something far worse than we could ever imagine. A town on the edge. As the investigation progressed, the residents of Subrink were torn between these conflicting theories. Some clung to the hope that there was a rational explanation behind the calls, while others began to fear that they were at the mercy of something far darker, beyond human comprehension. The town was divided. Some believed in the scientific explanation, others in the paranormal, and still, others feared that Subrink had been chosen as the site of a sinister experiment. For Detective Parker, the lines between the possible and the impossible were beginning to blur. Each theory seemed to open up new questions, new possibilities, but none of them provided the concrete answers he needed. The phone calls continued, the fear intensified, and Subrink found itself standing on the precipice of something far more terrifying than anyone had ever expected. The phone calls in Subrink had taken a terrifying turn. As the days passed, the mystery deepened, and the consequences of answering those cursed calls became ever more horrifying. While the investigation continued, one unsettling fact emerged. Those who answered the phone had begun to change. Some had disappeared without a trace, others had lost their sanity, and some even seemed to die under inexplicable circumstances. Subrink had become a town on the brink of collapse, held hostage by an unseen force. The first victim. Thomas Halloran. The first of the town's residents to suffer the consequences of answering the phone was Thomas Halloran, a local businessman who had made a name for himself as the owner of the only general store in Subrink. Known for his pragmatic outlook and no-nonsense attitude, Thomas had always been a skeptic when it came to anything paranormal. However, that was before the phone call. It came in the dead of night, as most of the other calls had. Thomas was at home, in his small, modest house on the outskirts of town, when the phone rang. He was accustomed to late-night calls, sometimes from the store's suppliers or late-shift workers, but this call was different. The voice on the other end wasn't familiar, and it wasn't human. It sounded wrong. The words were unclear, muffled, as though being distorted by static, yet they were chillingly coherent. "Thomas, we know what you did," the voice whispered. At first, Thomas had tried to brush it off. He assumed it was some kind of prank, a product of his tired mind. But when the voice started listing things about him, details of his life no one else could possibly know, Thomas's confidence began to waver. "I'm not afraid of you," Thomas had shouted into the phone, hoping to assert some control over the situation. But the voice only laughed, low, guttural, mocking, and then the line went dead. The following days were marked by an eerie change in Thomas. He became withdrawn, his once sharp mind now dulled, his temper erratic. People who spoke with him noted a strange unease in his eyes, a vacant look that wasn't there before. He started to avoid contact with anyone, retreating into his home. But it wasn't just his behavior that changed. His health began to deteriorate rapidly, his skin paling, his body weakening, as though the life was being slowly drained from him. By the end of the week, Thomas Halloran had vanished. His store remained open, but the man himself was gone, his house empty, his belongings scattered as though he had simply walked out in the middle of the night. No one could explain it. The police found no trace of him, no sign of forced entry, no indication of foul play. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. The town buzzed with rumors. Some believed he had left voluntarily, perhaps to escape the pressure of the growing mystery. Others, however, whispered that the phone call had driven him mad, pushing him to take his own life. But there were those who knew the truth, that the calls were not just words. They were a harbinger of doom, a curse that preyed on the vulnerable and the strong alike. The horror of Karen Walker. The next victim was Karen Walker, a well-respected local schoolteacher who had been an integral part of the community for years. She had always been the voice of reason and calm in Subrink, a woman everyone trusted. But when the phone rang on the morning of April 17, 2023, Karen's life would never be the same. Karen had been in her kitchen, preparing breakfast, when the phone call came through. The voice on the other end was hauntingly familiar. It was the same distorted voice that had haunted Subrink for weeks, but it now seemed closer, more personal. "Karen, we're watching you, you're not safe." Karen listened in disbelief as the voice continued. It spoke of things no one could possibly know about her. It mentioned the death of her mother, a secret she had never told anyone. It spoke about her troubled relationship with her father, about moments she had kept hidden deep within her heart. But it wasn't the memories that haunted her. It was the unsettling feeling that whoever was on the other side of that call wasn't just listening to her life, but controlling it. After hanging up, Karen's behavior began to shift. She became more paranoid, more erratic. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched at all times, that the very walls of her home were closing in on her. Her friends and family noticed how she withdrew from them, stopped answering their calls, and refused to leave her house. One evening, a few days after the call, Karen left her home in a hurry, with no explanation. It was as though she was being drawn somewhere, driven by something beyond her control. Her last known location was near the edge of the forest that bordered Subrink. When the authorities arrived, they found no sign of her, no tracks, no evidence of where she had gone. Karen Walker had vanished, just like Thomas Halloran before her. The investigation that followed revealed nothing. But those who knew Karen weren't so quick to dismiss the possibility that the calls had something to do with her disappearance. It seemed that answering the phone wasn't just a matter of receiving a strange call, it was a death sentence. The toll on the town, a growing desperation. As the disappearances mounted, so did the sense of dread within Subrink. The people who answered the phone calls didn't simply fade away. They changed, deteriorated, or disappeared altogether. The phone calls had become a death sentence, a punishment for anyone unlucky enough to be on the other end of the line. Some survivors of the calls began to speak out, but their accounts were fragmented and incoherent, like puzzle pieces that didn't fit together. Some claimed that they heard voices not just from the phone, but inside their heads, as if their thoughts were no longer their own. Others described vivid, terrifying dreams that felt more like memories, as if they had lived lives they couldn't remember. One man, Michael Donovan, claimed that after he answered the phone, he was flooded with memories of things that had never happened to him. He spoke of a parallel world where Subrink was a different place, darker, more foreboding. In that world, the people were gone, and the town had become a husk, consumed by an evil force. Michael said he was certain that what he saw was a glimpse of the future, a future that would come to pass if the phone calls were not stopped. By now, there was no rational explanation for what was happening. No one could understand the connection between the people who had vanished, or the strange and disturbing visions that followed the phone calls. It seemed clear that something far more sinister was at play, a force that had set its sights on Subrink and was slowly picking off its inhabitants, one by one. A town in mourning. With the growing number of disappearances, Subrink's atmosphere grew heavier. The once tight-knit community was now a shell of its former self, filled with fear and suspicion. People spoke in hushed tones, afraid to answer their phones, afraid to leave their homes. They had seen what happened to those who had answered the calls, and they knew that the town was now marked. As Detective Parker looked at the mounting evidence, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what was happening. Subrink was falling apart. The phone calls had touched every corner of the town, claiming its residents, and leaving behind a town paralyzed by fear and loss. The investigation into the mysterious phone calls that had haunted Subrink for months had come to a tragic, unsettling end. Despite the exhaustive efforts of local law enforcement and a handful of brave individuals determined to uncover the truth, the mystery surrounding the calls had not only remained unsolved, but had grown deeper and more perplexing with each passing day. As the final pieces of the puzzle were laid out, the questions only multiplied. What had really happened to those who answered the phones? What was the connection between the disappearances, the strange visions, and the inexplicable deaths? And most importantly, who, or what, was behind the calls that seemed to know things no one could explain? The last call. The final breakthrough came unexpectedly. Detective Parker had managed to track one last phone call to a remote phone booth near the edge of the town, where many of the missing had been last seen. The booth had been abandoned for years, and no one could recall the last time it had been used. Yet, the phone records from that night showed a call had been placed from the booth, one that lasted only 30 seconds, but those precious seconds were enough to send a chill down Parker's spine. The call wasn't a typical one. The voice on the other end wasn't the distorted, chilling tone that had terrorized Subrink for so long. This time it was different. It was cold, distant, almost mechanical. And the words it spoke were simple yet profound. "You were never meant to know." The words echoed in Parker's mind long after he ended the call, leaving him shaken to his core. What did it mean? Who had made the call? And why were these cryptic words the last message left by the entity behind the phones? The eerie nature of the phone call left Parker with more questions than answers, but the one thing he was sure of was this: the truth about what had happened to Subrink would never be fully revealed. There were no neat conclusions, no easy explanations. The phone calls had been nothing short of a curse, a force that defied reason and understanding. A town forever changed. Subrink as a town would never be the same. The once bustling community now stood in ruins, both physically and emotionally. Many of the townspeople had left, fleeing the haunting presence that seemed to hang over their homes, while others stayed behind, too afraid to leave but too broken to carry on. The families of the missing still clung to hope, despite all the evidence that pointed to the fact that their loved ones were gone, likely taken by whatever dark force had lurked behind the mysterious calls. Some still placed flowers at the homes of the missing, others stood at the edge of the forest, hoping that one day they might return, even though deep down, they knew that it was impossible. The final chapter of Subrink's story was a somber one, with little closure. The phone calls had not only destroyed lives, but had left an indelible mark on the town's history, a scar that would never heal. The locals had grown quiet, their eyes shifting nervously when they passed one another in the streets. The shadows seemed darker, the nights longer, and the memories of what had happened never far from their minds. The unanswered questions loomed over Subrink, forever hanging in the air like a dense fog, obscuring the truth from view. Was it paranormal? A dark, supernatural force that had chosen Subrink for reasons no one could comprehend? Or was it something else, an experiment gone horribly wrong, or perhaps a malevolent force that had somehow tapped into the human psyche, playing with their deepest fears and darkest desires? A conclusion that isn't one. And so, the mystery of Subrink came to a close, or at least, a form of closure that left the truth as elusive as ever. The police records were sealed, the files marked with unresolved, and the case quietly shelved. There would be no press conference, no grand reveal. The residents of Subrink, like the phone calls themselves, had faded into silence. The few who remained in Subrink told the story over and over, but as the years went by, their voices grew fainter, their words softer. Eventually, the town became little more than a footnote in history, a place spoken of in hushed tones by those who had heard the rumors. There were whispers, of course, about the calls and the horrors they had brought. But no one truly knew the truth, not really. And that was how it would remain. A legacy of fear. The story of Subrink would eventually be forgotten by most, but for the survivors, the ones who had heard the calls and lived to tell the tale, it was a scar that would never fade. The fear that had taken hold of them, the terror they had felt in their bones, was something they could never fully escape. Every time a phone rang in the distance, or when they passed an old telephone booth by the side of the road, their hearts would race, a deep-seated unease creeping into their thoughts. They would never know if there was more to the story. They would never know who had been behind those chilling phone calls. The truth was never revealed, and perhaps it never would be. But one thing was certain. Whatever force had taken hold of Subrink had changed them forever. Some of the survivors tried to move on, to rebuild their lives elsewhere. Others stayed, forever haunted by the dark echoes of the past. But deep down in their hearts they all knew the same thing. The truth behind the calls, the mystery that had consumed their town, would never truly be uncovered. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying thing of all.